saw the war as a great revolutionary opportunity and wrote essays encouraging soldiers of all nations to rebel.
He wants them to turn their guns against their officers. He's trying to make World War I into a class conflict and actually sees it as an opportunity. Here, for the first time, millions of poor people have guns.
But at the start of the war, no one in Russia was listening to Lenin. Instead, the country jumped wholeheartedly into the war, particularly the Tsar. In a grand gesture of nationalism, he changed the name of the capital from St. Petersburg to Petrograd, a more Russian-sounding name, and led the nation onto the battlefield. For the poorly equipped Russian army, the war was a disaster. They lost nearly every battle. Millions of soldiers died of typhus, and millions more deserted. In the cities, more suffering. Inflation wiped out people's savings, and food shortages forced near-starving women to wait in long bread lines. The wrath of Russia spilled into the streets of Petrograd on February 23, 1917. Mobs roamed the streets, armed with guns taken from government arsenals. Soldiers refused to fire on them. Some even fired on their own officers and then joined the mob. Crowds broke into prisons and released the prisoners. The capital was in chaos. Within a week, the Tsar abdicated his rule, and all of Russia celebrated. Lenin read about the revolution in a Swiss newspaper. The event he had worked toward, prepared for, and dreamed of was taking place in his country's capital, and Lenin wasn't there to lead it.
He was delighted to hear that the Tsar's government had fallen. He was undoubtedly panicked, though, that it was happening without him, because Lenin always distrusts spontaneous things. He doesn't want this revolution, therefore, to continue sort of in a spontaneous way. He wants it directed, and, of course, he believes he's the guy to do it.
As the victorious workers and soldiers celebrated, two groups began to form that would fight for power: the Provisional Government and the Workers' Soviets. The Provisional Government was Lenin's nemesis. This moderate group, composed of leaders of the Duma, was led by the passionate orator Alexander Kerensky.
He looked like a giant of the revolution. And Lenin used to call him Windbag Kerensky. And it's true that his main strength was oratory. Lenin would avoid trying to have oratorical duels with Kerensky, because as a speaker, Kerensky really always prevailed.
Lenin supported the other contender for power, the Soviets, which were representatives of workers, soldiers, and peasants, elected by the trade unions. From Switzerland, Lenin sent a blistering wire to the Petrograd Bolsheviks that read, "Our tactics, complete mistrust, no support for the new government. We especially suspect Kerensky." German officials could see that getting Lenin back to Russia to stir up conflict could help them defeat Russia in the war. They paid for a train to take Lenin and his followers through Germany and into Russia. The train arrived in Petrograd a month after the initial revolt.
Lenin's arrival back in Russia at the famous Finland station in April 1917 would have made a wonderful movie, maybe even a comedy. You see, his Bolsheviks back in the capital, led at this time by Stalin and Molotov, had been swept up in this whole idea of a successful revolution. The Tsar had been overthrown. Everybody is celebrating. Lenin gets off the train in a foul and nasty mood. It immediately begins attacking and criticizing the guys who came to meet him, and then climbs up on a platform and begins shrieking at everybody that the revolution has only begun. What we have to do is keep the revolution alive, overthrow the provisional government, and move immediately to a socialist revolution.
Lenin's arrival at the Finland station is so steeped in myth and lore that many events are attributed to it that actually happened elsewhere. Here, in Sergei Eisenstein's 1927 film October, Lenin preaches to an adoring crowd of peasant soldiers who appear unified in their readiness for revolution. In truth, few people thought that Lenin's call for revolution was a good idea. His plan, known as the April Thesis, was so extreme that the editors of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda refused to print it.
They were afraid that this call for down with the war, down with the provisional government, make another revolution, could be interpreted as giving aid and comfort to the German enemy. So they're afraid to put this stuff out front in terms of the party's program for fear of a possible backlash to it.
While Lenin argued with his party, the provisional government continued the war with Germany, sending battle-weary troops back to the front. But a disastrous battle in Austria ended all pretense of victory. Troops deserted by the thousands, and military discipline disintegrated. In July, the Petrograd military garrison was called to the front and refused to go. Instead, mobs of armed soldiers, fired up by the angry rhetoric of the Bolsheviks, roamed the streets, smashing windows, looting, and killing. In a brilliant response, the government announced to the demonstrators that Lenin was a German spy sent into Russia to undermine the government. That confused the demonstrators, who were finally dispersed by a machine gunner on a nearby roof, spraying bullets over the crowd. The demonstration was a disaster for Lenin and the Bolsheviks.
Lenin was not a German spy in any sense of the word, nor an agent in what that implies. There was simply a temporary convergence of interests, you might say, where each was trying to use the other. The Germans were supporting any elements in Russia that would undermine the Russian war effort, and Lenin was willing to take support from any unsavory source that would promote his revolutionary effort.
The following day, as warrants went out for the arrest of all the Bolshevik leaders on the charges of high treason, Lenin shaved his distinctive beard, put on a wig, and sneaked out of Petrograd into Finland. At age 47, unsure if he would ever return to Russia, he hid in a field hut on a Finnish farm, writing and waiting. In August 1917, Vladimir Lenin was at the low point of his political career, hiding in Finland, disguised as a farm worker. But soon events in Russia began turning back in his favor. General Kornilov, one of Russia's most respected generals, was threatening to march on Petrograd to take over the government by force. In desperate need of allies, Alexander Kerensky appealed to the Bolsheviks for help, releasing their leaders from prison and distributing some 40,000 rifles to the workers of Petrograd to defend the capital against Kornilov's likely attack. The attack never materialized, and now Lenin's supporters were out of prison and armed. Kerensky's government was without military support. Still in hiding, Lenin called for the armed overthrow of the government in the name of the Petrograd Soviet.
The Bolsheviks were at the point of coming to power without violence as the strength of the Soviet in Petrograd increased and as the provisional government crumbled. Lenin didn't want to let that happen. He said this is school book exercises in constitutionalism. History will not forgive us if we don't move now and seize power by force. He wanted to have it by force and compel everyone who wouldn't accept his seizure by force to be against it.
On the evening of October 24th, Lenin wrapped his head with bandages as if he'd had a tooth pulled and sneaked across Petrograd to the Bolshevik headquarters. That night, he took command of the Bolshevik Red Guard units. He sent them out all over Petrograd, where they quietly took control of critical positions in the city, simply by replacing the guards on duty. No shots were fired. Now all that remained was to capture the leaders of the provisional government who were being guarded in the Winter Palace.
The way it's portrayed in the movies is, there's a gunshot and a bugle call and these guys all go scurrying across the snow and at great personal risk storm their way into the palace and overthrow the old regime. Actually, it was nothing like that at all. The storming of the Winter Palace, the storming in quotation marks, was a prolonged period that took place over many, many hours. Various Red Guards breaking out windows and trying to crawl in. It was a very slow, drawn-out process, really. And it was a process that was probably lubricated by a fair amount of alcohol, because St. Petersburg had some of the great wine cellars of Europe.
Eventually, the Red Guards found the provisional government, arrested them, and took them to jail. Thus, one of the most important turnovers of political power in history took place with almost no bloodshed. Once in power, Lenin moved with shocking speed to abolish the democratic gains won by the February Revolution. He dissolved the democratically elected Constituent Assembly, shut down the opposition newspapers, and outlawed all political parties except the Bolsheviks, who he renamed the Communist Party. He also pulled Russia out of the war, giving Germany 1/4 of Russia's land, but solidifying his popularity with the soldiers and workers. But peace with Germany did not give Lenin peace at home. Army units loyal to the Tsar, now called the White Army, were rising up in civil war against the communists. Lenin moved the government to Moscow and sequestered himself in the Kremlin. From his sanctuary with its ever-present no smoking sign, he issued decrees that instigated random terror all over Russia, urging peasants to kill landlords, workers to kill capitalists.
He wanted to introduce such a terror from the very beginning that nobody would dare, to resist or to deviate from the lines that he had imposed, you see. But for us at that time, he looked like we called him Grandpa Lenin, a nice man, who is caring for everybody. That was the propaganda that we all the time, put in our heads.
The killing of civilians during the Red Terror included even the most celebrated of citizens, Nicholas Romanov, the former Tsar. Fearing that he could become a rallying symbol for the White Army, Lenin approved orders to execute Nicholas and his family. Soon the violence begun in the Kremlin reached Lenin himself. As he left a Moscow factory, Lenin was shot twice at close range. His would-be assassin was Fanya Kuplin, a socialist revolutionary who believed Lenin had betrayed the revolution by disbanding the Constituent Assembly. She was executed 5 days later. The day following the assassination attempt, 512 enemies of the state were killed in reprisal.
So the terror became really sort of a political tool. Not for revolution anymore, but for keeping the revolutionary Bolsheviks in power. And of course it was on a huge scale, not on a scale it would reach under Stalin in the 1930s, but still something which Europe had not seen for a century or so.
Lenin recovered quickly from the attempted assassination, and within weeks he was back at the Kremlin, posing for cameras to assure the country that he was all right. He even demonstrated where the bullets entered. 49-year-old Lenin was now at the height of his career, but he had only a few more years to enjoy it. In 1919, Lenin assembled an international Congress of Communists, hoping to stimulate revolution in the rest of the world.
There were good reasons to believe in 1917, 18, and 19 that there might well be world revolutions. After all, in 1917, the French army had mutinied. In 1918, the German Navy mutinies. Hungary is in turmoil. And Lenin remembers that that's how it started in Russia, as a soldier's revolt. Therefore, it's not at all crazy to imagine that the world was on the brink in 1917 and 18 of a world revolution.
Though the revolution in Europe never came, the Red Army was able to defeat the anti-communists in Russia. By 1921, 50-year-old Lenin was the undisputed leader of a devastated country. Reconstruction was a back-breaking task made more difficult by a drought socialism, letting farmers sell their crops and keep the profits. Lenin called it a strategic retreat, and it was a tremendous success. By the end of the year, Lenin was suffering from insomnia, nausea, and fainting spells. He retired with Krupskaya to a rural retreat in Gorky, southeast of Moscow, where he suffered his first stroke. The next year, Lenin alternated between frenetic political activity and physical collapse. But after his second stroke, at age 51, he could barely move or talk. He began painstakingly dictating a diary, still trying to influence the running of the country.
The period between the second and third strokes is extremely important politically. That is when Lenin realized that his whole revolutionary endeavor was going awry, that Russian circumstances, Russian backwardness, Russian bureaucratic habits were making it difficult, if not impossible, to move very fast towards his communist ideal.
Before Lenin could make any meaningful changes, he suffered his third stroke. His illness was concealed from all but the top leadership for the next 10 months. When he finally died on January 21st, 1924, at the age of 53, most of Russia was shocked by the news.
That funeral was an extraordinary event. It was a cathartic event. I really do believe that as the first public ritual of mourning following World War I, the Revolution, and the Civil War, that it drew people in a powerful way. It was many degrees below zero, and yet something like 750,000 people lined up over a period of about 5 days to view his body and state.
The father said that Lenin died. And it was really like a shock, you know. Then these 2 words, Lenin died, you know, made like something broken, you know, inside my heart, something I cried, you know. And it was so, you know, terrible.
I believe that it was the enormous crowds that had come to his funeral that then helped some of the authorities decide to embalm Lenin's body and keep it on display, which is where it is now, still, in Red Square.
As influential as he was in life, Lenin may have been more so in death. Over 100 million have lined up to view his mummified body. His memory has been used to support every change in Soviet policy and every new regime since his death. And his theories inspired the successful revolutions of Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh, as well as countless other revolutionaries in countries full of oppressed and powerless people.
I think Lenin deserves a lot of credit for the notion that was important, maybe more important in the first half of the century, that the meat can inherit the earth, that there can be a political movement based on social justice and equality. The fact that that didn't turn out for the best, the fact that that didn't turn out the way he thought it would turn out, is not necessarily, I think, something you can blame him for.
But people do blame Lenin. For most, it's difficult to forget that Lenin's Red Terror set the stage for the murderous purges of Stalin and the corruption of the Soviet bureaucracy.
In the long run, it's hard to think of any positive legacy that Lenin left to Russia or the world.
The mummification of Lenin is a fitting metaphor for his political legacy. Lenin mistakenly predicted the withering away of the state. Instead, just like his body, the state he created failed to wither. Most of Russia considers Lenin's body and his legacy a burden. But whatever happens to his shell, Lenin, the voice of the revolution, will be heard well into the next millennium.
Grandpa Lenin, a nice man, who is caring for everybody. That was the propaganda that was all the time, put in our heads.
He has been called treacherous, deluded, out of touch, and insane.
Most of his fellow Bolsheviks believed that he was mad.
His rise to power in the Russian Revolution combined lofty idealism and deadly ruthlessness.
He loved so much listening to Beethoven that he knew that he had to deprive himself of it because it made him feel soft.
With the dismantling of communism in Russia, a true picture of Lenin is gradually emerging. Newly opened secret government files are revealing a fanatical philosopher who might have been a minor footnote in history, but for an amazing series of circumstances, decisions, and events that catapulted him into the headlines of the century. January 1924. Lenin dies, and over 500,000 Russian citizens line up in the freezing cold to pay homage to him. From that day, the memory of Lenin is engineered to serve the state. His statue appears in every Soviet town square. His picture in every school.
The Bolsheviks, like any new revolutionary regime, needed legitimacy. They needed myths. Lenin became an important part of this myth, the great and wise founder.
Then in 1991, the communist government collapses and the deification turns to vilification. One by one, the icons of the father of communism come tumbling down. But Lenin won't go away. Though his picture has been removed from every school and factory, his mummified body remains on display, and many Russians still want to keep it that way. Who is this man who can hold a nation captive 4 generations after his death? He was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the third of 6 children, on April 10, 1870, in this house in Simbirsk, a provincial town in central Russia. His father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, was an inspector for the provincial schools, working his way to the honorary title of a nobleman. His mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was the daughter of a successful German doctor. Lenin grew up in a comfortable but not wealthy home.
It's kind of a historical puzzle how Lenin turned out to be Lenin.
The
the surprising thing is Lenin did not come from the dysfunctional family that you would think would generate such a uncompromising radical. It was actually a very warm, close-knit family.
A few photographs of Lenin as a child have been preserved. And like the facts of his life, the photos have been carefully retouched by zealous myth builders. This one, surely to emphasize what a brilliant child he was. His sister described him as pert and jolly, a boy who loved to run and play loud games. He also liked to tease and play pranks on other children.
Do you know those bossy kids? He was a very rowdy, bossy, self-centered, competent, and smart child.
All the wholesome events in Lenin's life have been documented by Soviet painters. Every Russian student knows that Lenin learned French and German at home from his mother. From his stern and distant father, Lenin got his passion for chess, which he played constantly, often winning against several opponents at one time. Lenin was an aggressive debater who loved reading the classics. His older brother, Alexander, was shy, gentle, and introspective. His love was science, and he experimented with chemistry at home. Alexander graduated high school with honors and left for St. Petersburg to study science. There was no future for a budding scientist in small-town Simbirsk.
It was boring, it was dirty, it was undeveloped. It was a place of sharp polarization between haves and have-nots, and not only in terms of money, but in terms of education. And Lenin is born into a family that's part of the intelligentsia. And for a member of the intelligentsia in a small town like this, the major goal was to get out.
Simbirsk was one of thousands of provincial towns that dotted the Russian countryside in the late 1800s, and all around it were reminders of the ills that plagued Russia. The peasants in the nearby fields made up 80% of Russia's population. They had recently been freed from serfdom, but their lives had barely changed. They continued to scratch a meager existence from the unforgiving soil, still indebted to the wealthy landowners. Some of them had migrated to the cities, looking for a better life in the factories of Moscow and St. Petersburg. But Russia's factories were big and inefficient. The wages were poor and the conditions worse. They quickly became places of smoldering discontent. And above it all, the Tsar, the last remaining absolute monarch in the Western world, celebrating his family's 300-year reign and snuffing out any spark of democratic reform.
One good way of looking at this, I think, is to think of Russian society and politics at the end of the 19th century as a kind of a pressure cooker. You had a czar and an imperial government that did everything it could to hold back any kind of reform, to hold back any kind of political participation on any level. There really weren't any legitimate outlets to become political, to be part of the system. This, to a significant extent, is what forces a lot of members of the intelligentsia into radical politics.
St. Petersburg was the center for the revolutionary underground, and it was here that an event took place that would change Lenin's life. His older brother, the shy chemist Alexander, joined a student terrorist group at the university. His senior year, Alexander was arrested after he was discovered with a bomb he had built, hidden inside of a medical encyclopedia. A bomb intended for the Tsar. In court, Alexander refused to ask for mercy. Instead, he boldly proclaimed, "After studying social and economic sciences, I realized that a change in the social system is not only possible, but unavoidable." Alexander was hanged along with 4 of his co-conspirators. He was 21.
Soviet biographers say that Lenin put his hand on his mother's shoulder and said, ours will be another path, meaning that the death of Alexander immediately made Lenin realize that he would become a revolutionary that was a Marxist and not a terrorist. I mean, that's total nonsense. He might have said those words, but that would have been just to reassure his mother that he's not going to take a path in which he's going to end up killing himself at the age of 20. I don't think he was that interested at that time in revolution.
The death of Alexander was the second shock to the Ulyanovs in less than a year. The previous summer, Lenin's father had suffered a stroke and died at the age of 53. Lenin's secure world was coming apart. At 17, he was now the head of a devastated household. And as the brother of a convicted assassin, Lenin would now be closely watched by the Tsar's police. In 1887, Vladimir Lenin graduated high school. He was first in his class, receiving a gold medal and high praise from his teachers. He thought he was headed for a career as a lawyer and enrolled in the Kazan University Law School, but he didn't stay there long. 2 months into his first semester, Lenin joined a demonstration to protest some university regulations. It was a minor event, but as the brother of a terrorist, Lenin was being carefully watched. He was immediately expelled from school with no hope of returning. Lenin had now been singled out by the same repressive system that had executed his older brother. On his own, he began to study the works that had influenced his brother, Marx and Engels, Plekhanov, and a radical Russian novelist named Chernyshevsky, who preached violent revolution.
Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done was a book that influenced Lenin more than did the writings of Marx. As he said it plowed me over. The idea of the book was that young people who are dedicated to helping Russia need to improve themselves and make themselves so strong that they could take charge of Russia's future. Because one of the things that was so demoralizing to the revolutionaries of the period is that there seemed to be no one they could count on. And so the idea that if you can't trust the peasantry, you can't trust the working class, whom can you trust? You can trust yourselves, you can trust revolutionaries.
Lenin joined a clandestine Marxist study group. During that time, a famine gripped the region near his home, killing over 300,000 people. Lenin refused to offer any assistance to the victims.
His idea was that the worse things are, the better things are. That's the way he put it. That if you start helping people at this stage, then you'll prolong the popular rage that will lead to revolution.
The revolution that Lenin now hoped for was the one predicted by revolutionaries. Marx believed that the socialist revolution would occur in a developed nation, like Germany or England, when the oppressed working masses revolted against the capitalists who were exploiting them. He specifically rejected Russia as a